My mother looked me straight in the eye at Christmas dinner and said, "This isn't your place anymore." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the smell of roast turkey and pine candles, it all blurred. Then I saw her face, calm and certain, and my father's smirk right beside her. He didn't say a word, just leaned back in his chair like he'd been waiting for this moment. We were sitting in the dining room of the old Miller house in Golden, Colorado, the same house I grew up in, the same one I used to think would last forever. The chandelier above the table cast a warm light over everything, polished silver. Christmas garlands. Ben's wife Lydia, in her perfect red dress. My younger brother, always the golden boy, laughed softly at something, she whispered. They looked like a magazine spread, not a family. I stared at the empty chair next to my father, the seat that used to be mine. It was where I'd sat every Christmas until the year I left for Portland. 13 years gone. But somehow I still thought the seat would be waiting. Apparently not. I hesitated, half standing, not sure what to do with my hands. My mother's smile didn't waver. We thought it would be better for Lydia to sit next to your father. You've got your own life now. Ethan. She said it like she was explaining something reasonable. Like this wasn't exile wrapped in manners. My father added, "It's just a chair. Son, don't make a thing out of it." Lydia touched Ben's arm and smiled politely at me. We didn't want to make it awkward. Ethan. I let out a small laugh I didn't feel and moved to the far end of the table. The scrape of the chair legs sounded louder than it should have. I sat down beside my grandfather, Arthur, who was quietly buttering a roll like none of this surprised him. He didn't look at me. Not yet. But I noticed his hand resting on something near his plate. A small, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. Dinner carried on like a show no one wanted to cancel. My mother passed the potatoes. Lydia complimented the wine. My father told a story about his old construction business that had everyone laughing but me. I barely tasted my food. Every time I looked at my father, I saw the smirk, the satisfaction of putting me back in my place. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue felt heavy. What would I even say that it still hurt to be the outsider in my own home, that I hadn't flown 1,000 miles just to be told to sit somewhere else? No one at that table would have understood. I looked around the room, tracing the things that hadn't changed: the family photos, the fireplace, the creak in the floorboard near the window. Everything looked exactly the same. And yet it felt like I'd broken into someone else's house. When dessert came, my father raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, looking directly at Ben and Lydia. "To the next generation of Millers." My mother dabbed at her eyes, proud and glowing. Lydia smiled, hand on her stomach. "Pregnant." Of course. I put down my fork. That explained everything. The new seat, the sudden talk of future. I wasn't just being pushed aside. I was being replaced. Arthur finally spoke, his voice steady and low. "That's quite a toast. Richard. New beginnings are fine, as long as you remember where you started." My father chuckled. "Don't worry, Dad. We remember just fine." "Do you?" Arthur said, not looking up. Silence crept in, subtle but sharp. Lydia shifted in her chair. My mother smiled tightly and started stacking plates. Ben tried to change the subject, talking about his real estate work downtown. But the tension had already settled like fog. I leaned toward my grandfather. "You okay, old man?" He gave the faintest nod, his eyes still fixed on his plate. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Patience, Ethan." "Not yet." He slid the envelope closer to his hand and finally met my eyes. There was something in his look, something that said he knew exactly what was happening and wasn't finished with it. The rest of dinner passed in fragments. My mother talking about Lydia's baby shower, my father bragging about Ben's new house. I answered when someone spoke to me but kept my focus on that envelope near my grandfather's fingers. The wax seal glinted under the chandelier. After coffee, people started moving around the house. My mother insisted on family photos by the tree. Ben put his arm around our parents while I stood a step away, barely fitting in the frame. The camera clicked. My mother said, "Perfect." When the lights dimmed and everyone drifted to the living room, I slipped back into the dining room. The table was cleared. Only the soft scent of cinnamon and wine left in the air. My grandfather was still there, sitting quietly, the envelope now resting in front of him. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. I forced a smile. "I'm used to it. No one should ever get used to being treated like they don't belong." He pushed the envelope toward me. I stared at it but didn't touch it. "What's this?" He leaned back in his chair. "Something your grandmother wanted you to have. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon." I looked down at the wax seal. At the initials carved into it, C.M. Charlotte Miller. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable. I swallowed hard. "Grandpa. What's going on?" He gave me that same patient smile I remembered from when I was a kid. The one that said he knew more than he was letting on. "Eat your pie. Son. Some things take time." Outside, snow started to fall against the windows. Soft and steady. Inside, the house hummed with laughter from the living room. The kind that excluded me without even trying. I sat across from my grandfather in the fading light. The envelope between us. And for the first time that night, I felt something shift. I didn't know what was in that letter. But I knew it mattered. More than anything anyone had said at that table. I reached for my coffee cup, my hand still trembling slightly. Across the room, my father's voice carried over from the living room. He was talking about selling the back lot next spring. Lydia's laugh followed. Smooth and confident. My grandfather's eyes narrowed. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The envelope sat there like a secret waiting to explode. And I remember thinking, maybe this wasn't the end of my place in this house. Maybe it was the beginning of theirs unraveling. The clock in the hallway chimed 9, echoing through the house. My grandfather stood up slowly, his hand on my shoulder as he passed. "Get some sleep, Ethan. Tomorrow will make more sense." I looked down at the envelope again. The faint light catching on the wax seal. I didn't know it then. But that single piece of paper would change everything about what this family thought they owned. The laughter from the other room kept going. But I didn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was my grandfather's voice in my head. "Patience, Ethan. Not yet." The envelope lay in front of me. And for the first time all night, I didn't feel like the one who didn't belong. I felt like the one who knew something they didn't. I went upstairs after everyone had gone to bed. But sleep didn't come. The house was too quiet. And that silence carried the weight of years I'd spent trying to earn a place at that table. The snow outside had stopped, leaving a soft glow through the window. I sat on the edge of the bed in my old room. Or what used to be my room. The walls were the same pale blue I painted when I was 16. But the posters were gone, replaced with framed photos of Ben and Lydia. Even here, I was a guest. I thought about Grandpa's words, about the envelope sealed with my grandmother's initials. I wanted to tear it open, but something told me to wait. Arthur Miller wasn't a man who played games. If he said soon, he meant it. I placed the envelope carefully in my duffel bag and turned off the lamp. Sleep dragged me backward into memories I didn't ask for. I was 9 again, sitting at the dinner table with my report card in hand. A row of A's. 1 B in gym. I'd been proud of it until my father's voice cut through the clatter of plates. "You can't build a life with grades, Ethan. You need real skills. Something that matters." He turned to Ben, who was 7 and already the favorite. My dad used to brag about how Ben could throw a baseball straight through the air, how he'd be a natural leader one day. Mom always nodded along, beaming. When it was my turn, she'd talk about how I was quiet and responsible. Words people used when they couldn't think of a compliment. I still remember Grandpa watching from the end of the table, not saying much. After dinner, he found me in the garage, sitting on the step next to the lawnmower. He handed me a small wooden box filled with screws, nails, and an old wrench. "You don't need to be loud to matter," he told me. "You just need to hold things together when everyone else is pulling them apart." That night, he let me help him patch the fence outside, both of us working in the cold until our fingers went numb. It was the first time anyone made me feel like I was worth the effort. Years later, when I got accepted to the University of Colorado, I remember running into the kitchen waving the acceptance letter. Dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. "What's the major?" he asked. "Environmental law," I said, trying to sound proud. He lowered the paper just enough to look me in the eye. "Trees and politics. Great." Mom scolded him half-heartedly, but I could see it in her face. She agreed. She wanted a son who wore a suit and brought home deals, not one who argued about rivers and forests. Ben, on the other hand, was everything they wanted. By the time he turned 25, he had a real estate license and a fiancée who could host charity luncheons. My parents bragged about him like he was proof they'd done something right. I was the experiment that failed quietly. When Grandpa's health started slipping a few years later, I came back to visit. I remember standing on the porch, the house looking smaller than I remembered. He was sitting in his favorite chair, blanket across his knees. He smiled the moment he saw me. "I knew you'd come back," he said. "You've always had roots here, even when you didn't think so." We spent hours talking that week, mostly about Grandma Charlotte. He told me how they built this house themselves in the late 70s. Every beam, every nail, every plank had a story. He said she was the one who designed it, drew it all out by hand at the kitchen table. When I asked him why he never sold it after she died, he just smiled. "Some things aren't for sale, Ethan. They're for keeping safe." He looked at me then, really looked, and said, "One day this house will need you." I thought he meant fixing a pipe or repairing a fence. I didn't know he meant saving it. Now, lying in the half-dark of my old room, those words hit different. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 3 times. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, restless, and walked to the window. Snow blanketed the front yard, hiding the cracks in the walkway and the sag in the porch steps. I used to play football with Ben there, back when we were still brothers instead of rivals. I'd let him win most of the time. He never realized that. I remembered the day everything between us changed. It was after high school graduation. Dad handed Ben the keys to his old Ford truck. Said, "You've earned it." Then he turned to me and said, "You've got college. You'll figure it out." I tried to laugh it off, but it stuck like a splinter. That was the day I understood my place. The memory shifted again. I was 12, sitting under the stairs during a storm. Grandpa crawled in beside me, both of us listening to the wind rattle the windows. He told me stories about Grandma building this place while the blizzard hit outside. How she kept working even when the nails froze to her gloves. "That's where you get it from," he said. "The stubbornness. Don't lose it." I'd forgotten how much that meant until now. The floor creaked outside my room. I froze, listening. Soft footsteps. Then Grandpa's voice. Quiet but firm. "You awake, Ethan?" "Yeah," I said, opening the door. He stood there in his robe, holding a mug of tea. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Thought I'd check on you." He sat on the chair by the window, looking out at the snow. "You remember when you and Ben used to race down that hill on sleds?" I nodded. "You always lost on purpose." I smiled. He noticed everything. He took a slow sip of tea and sighed. "They don't understand you, son." "Never did. But Charlotte did. She saw the part of you that fights quiet battles. That's why she trusted you." I hesitated. "Trusted me with what?" He looked at me, his eyes tired but sharp. "With the truth." He stood up, set the mug on the windowsill, and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Just remember what I told you. Some things are meant to be kept safe." Then he left, his footsteps fading down the hall. I sat there for a long time, watching the snow pile up, my thoughts twisting around his words. The truth. What truth? The envelope in my bag felt heavier suddenly, like it was calling to me. I pulled it out, turned it over in my hands. The wax seal caught the faint light from the window. My thumb hovered over it. I wanted to know, but I could still hear his voice in my head. Not yet. So I put it back. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter downstairs. Lydia's voice, bright and sharp. My mother's laugh following right after. The smell of bacon filled the air. For a second, I almost believed it would be a normal day. Then I walked into the kitchen and saw them all crowded around the table. Ben in my father's seat, Lydia flipping pancakes like she owned the place. My mother looked up and smiled, polite and distant. Morning. Ethan. Coffee's in the pot. My father barely looked at me. Big day ahead, he said, sliding a folder across the table to Ben. The kind of day that sets the future. I poured myself a cup, watching quietly. On the counter sat a stack of envelopes stamped with the Denver First Bank logo. I recognized the seal immediately. My father's construction company had used that bank for decades. I didn't say a word, but something in my chest tightened. Ben grinned at me. You sticking around long this time? I forced a smile. Long enough to see how things turn out. He laughed, not catching the edge in my voice. Maybe we'll finally make you like Christmas again. I looked out the window. Snow was still falling, covering the tracks from the night before. Maybe, I said. But it came out flat. I didn't know it yet. But that morning was the start of something none of us could take back. The moment the ground under this family started to shift. The moment the house stopped being a home and became a battlefield. By mid-morning the laughter had died down, replaced by the low hum of my father's voice coming from his office. I carried my coffee down the hallway. Half curious, half uneasy. The door was cracked open, and I caught a glimpse of him at his desk. His phone pressed to his ear. Papers spread out in neat stacks. He didn't notice me. His tone was calm, businesslike. I already signed the documents, he said. The house will be part of the Denver Renewal Project once the board approves it. Keller promised we'd have the transfer done by spring. Just make sure the appraisal stays where we agreed. My stomach turned. Denver Renewal Project. I'd read about it months ago in the news. They were buying up old properties to bulldoze for commercial space. My father leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Don't worry about Arthur. He won't be a problem much longer. I pushed the door open before I could stop myself. What did you just say? He jumped, eyes narrowing as he hung up the phone. Ethan, you ever heard of knocking? I stepped inside, my pulse hammering. Who were you talking to? Business. None of your concern. I glanced at the papers on his desk. The top sheet was stamped Denver First Bank. The second was a mortgage agreement. Already signed. I picked it up. You mortgaged the house. He stood, snatching the papers from my hand. That's not what it looks like. It looks like you put the house up for sale. I said. You didn't even ask Grandpa. His jaw tightened. Arthur doesn't make the decisions anymore. I stared at him, disbelief mixing with anger. So that's it. You just sell it off to fix your mistakes. He let out a sharp laugh. You have no idea what it takes to keep this family together. That company you like to mock. The one that paid for your education. It's drowning because I spent years cleaning up after your idealism. Idealism. The word hit harder than he meant it to. You mean when I stopped working for those developers you backed? When I refused to defend people who paved over rivers? He slammed his hand on the desk. You don't get it. Ethan, sometimes you do what you have to do, even if it means selling your father's house. He hesitated, just long enough to confirm I was right. Get out, he said finally. I didn't move. Does Mom know? He looked away. She knows what she needs to. That was enough for me. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. In the hallway, Lydia was standing by the corner, pretending to fix her earring. She smiled politely. Everything okay in there? You tell me, I said. You seem to know a lot about the Denver Renewal Project. Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. Oh. That. Just something Ben mentioned. You know? Opportunities. I stepped closer. You mean like selling this house out from under your family? She tilted her head, that fake sweetness returning. Ethan. I'm just trying to help. Your parents want what's best for everyone. I nodded slowly. Everyone but me. She laughed lightly, brushing past me. Don't take it so personally. Not every fight needs a lawyer. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I went outside to clear my head. The air was sharp, the snow crunching under my boots. From the edge of the porch, I could see the hills where Grandpa used to take me sledding. Everything looked smaller now. Pieter. I wanted to call him, to tell him what I'd overheard. But something in me said to wait. He'd know when to act. He always did. I walked around the back of the house. And that's when I saw Ben by the garage. Phone in hand. He was pacing, talking quickly. Yeah, he said. Keller's confident it'll close before spring. Dad just has to get the old man to sign off. I froze. He turned, saw me, and ended the call immediately. Hey. Ethan. Didn't hear you coming. Who were you talking to? Just a client. That client have anything to do with Keller? He laughed. But it came out forced. You've been listening to too many conspiracy podcasts. I stepped closer. Don't lie to me. Ben. You're working with Dad on this deal. Aren't you? He crossed his arms. You don't get it. This place is falling apart. Selling it means Mom and Dad get to retire. It means the family gets a fresh start. By selling out everything Grandpa and Grandma built, he sighed. You left. Ethan. You made your choice. I stared at him, my hands trembling with anger. You think leaving means I stopped caring? He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, heavy and sharp. Finally, he said quietly, maybe it's time to let go. I turned to walk away, but his words followed me like a shadow. Inside, I found Grandpa sitting in the living room, a blanket over his legs, the afternoon sun cutting across his face. He looked up when I entered. Something on your mind? Son. They're planning to sell the house. I said. Dad already signed the papers. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. You knew. I suspected. Richard's been desperate for months. Why didn't you tell me? Because some truths need witnesses, not warnings. I sat across from him, trying to steady my breathing. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp and clear despite his age. This house is more than walls. Ethan. It's a promise. Charlotte built it to last through storms. But storms test who deserves to stay standing. He reached for his cane, pressing it into the floor. When people start selling what they didn't build, they forget what it cost. His words landed deep. What am I supposed to do? Grandpa. He looked at me with a small smile. Be patient. The truth always finds its moment. I wanted to believe him. But as I glanced toward the window, I saw my father and Ben outside, laughing near the truck. The same easy bond they'd always had. It twisted something in me. Something that felt like loss and anger rolled together. That night, the house was quiet again. I couldn't eat. My mother noticed but didn't say anything. Lydia talked about holiday decorations, and Ben kept checking his phone. Grandpa sat at the far end of the table, silent as stone, his eyes on my father. When dinner ended, Dad stood up, glass in hand. To the future, he said. To making hard choices. Grandpa tapped his cane once against the floor. Hard choices don't mean the right ones. My father ignored him. I caught Grandpa's eye, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not patience, resolve. After everyone went to bed, I went to my room and stared at the envelope in my bag again. My hand hovered over it, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Down the hall, I heard Grandpa's door close. The sound was soft, final. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The same house that once felt safe now groaned like it knew what was coming. Somewhere deep down, I realized Grandpa was right. Storms test who deserves to stay standing, and ours had just begun. The wind didn't stop that night. Not even for a minute. By morning, the world outside was buried under white. I woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs, and the faint smell of coffee. The house felt different, heavier somehow, like it was waiting for something to happen. When I walked into the kitchen, Grandpa was already there, sitting at the table, dressed in his old flannel shirt and jeans, Kane leaning beside him. He looked like a man who had already decided something. Morning, he said, not looking up from his cup. You sleep? Not much, I said. He nodded, slow and thoughtful. Sit. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. The pipes hummed. The snow outside pressed against the windows. Finally, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out another envelope. It looked just like the one in my bag. Same cream paper. Same wax seal, with the initials C. M. I thought you said not yet. I said quietly, this one's different. He replied. He slid it across the table. It's a copy. I keep the original where it belongs. What is it? He met my eyes. The truth. I held the envelope but didn't open it. He didn't expect me to. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the snow had started to melt under the pale light. Your grandmother knew this would happen, he said. She knew Richard would lose himself chasing things that don't last. That's why she left instructions. You were always meant to find them. Not him. I wanted to ask what kind of instructions, but he lifted his hand, stopping me. You'll know when you need to. Voices carried from the living room, sharp and clear. My mother, my father, and Lydia. I thought we agreed. My mother said, we don't need to drag Arthur into this. He's already in it. My father answered, he's the only one left on the deed. We can't finalize anything until he signs off. Lydia's voice was calm, almost soothing. Then convince him. Tell him it's for the family. I glanced at Grandpa. He didn't move. Didn't react. He just sipped his coffee, listening like a man measuring every word. They're planning something for today, I said. He smiled faintly. Then it's a good thing we're both awake. Later that afternoon, the house filled with neighbors for what my mother called a small gathering. She liked to keep appearances. Ben was busy handing out drinks, Lydia charming everyone with that polished smile. My father moved through the crowd, shaking hands like he was closing a deal. I stood near the fireplace, watching. The air smelled like perfume and fake pine. My mother caught my eye from across the room. Her smile was the kind that meant behave. Grandpa sat in his chair near the piano, his cane resting across his knees, the envelope still in his pocket. Every now and then, someone came up to say hello, and he nodded politely but said little. I found myself next to Lydia at the buffet table. She poured herself a glass of wine and said lightly, You've been quiet, Ethan. Just taking it all in. She tilted her head. You never did like crowds, did you? Depends on the company. She smiled. I'd almost believe that, if you weren't glaring at your father every 5 minutes. I took a sip of my drink. Maybe I'm just trying to remember what family's supposed to look like. Her smile didn't fade, but her voice dropped. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Your father's doing what's necessary. For who? She didn't answer. Before I could say anything else, my father tapped his glass, calling for attention. Everyone quieted down. Thank you all for coming, he began. As you know, it's been a big year for our family. Ben and Lydia are expecting, and we're preparing for some exciting changes ahead. I felt the words hit like stones. Preparing. That was his way of saying the deal was already in motion. Grandpa's voice broke through the silence. Steady but firm. Exciting changes like selling this house without telling me. The room froze. My father blinked, caught off guard, but recovered fast. Dad, we were going to talk about it. You're talking about it now, Arthur said. To me. A few guests shifted awkwardly, murmuring. My mother forced a laugh. Maybe we should save family matters for another time. Grandpa's gaze never left my father. I built this house with my hands. Your mother designed it with her heart. And now you're trading it for what, a check from a politician who's never set foot in it. Richard's jaw tightened. It's not like that. Then how is it? Grandpa asked. My father said nothing. Lydia touched his arm. A quiet signal to stop arguing in front of everyone. The room buzzed with polite discomfort. I felt my chest tighten. Enough, I said quietly. Everyone turned. If you're going to sell this place, at least have the decency to say it out loud. Ethan, my mother warned. Go ahead. Dad, tell everyone what this party's really about. My father's voice was clipped. This is not the time. Then when is it? After you've signed everything and packed Grandpa into a nursing home? Gasps rippled through the guests. My mother's face went pale. Richard stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. Don't you dare speak to me like that in my house. That's the problem, I said. It's not yours. Grandpa tapped his cane once, the sound cutting through the noise. That's enough. The room went still. His eyes moved from my father to me, then to the guests. I think we've entertained long enough. Thank you all for coming. One by one, people began to leave, murmuring polite excuses. My mother smiled stiffly at each of them, trying to hold together what little dignity was left. When the last car pulled away, the silence felt heavier than before. Richard turned on me. "You embarrassed this family." "No," I said. "You did." Lydia stepped between us, calm as ever. "This isn't helping anyone." Grandpa rose slowly, gripping his cane. "Enough. All of you." He walked toward me and reached into his jacket. Pulling out the envelope again, he held it out. Not to me this time, but to my father. "Do you know what this is?" "Richard." My father frowned. "Some letter from Mom. I'm guessing it's her will." Grandpa said softly. "The one you never bothered to read." The color drained from my father's face. Grandpa turned and handed the envelope to me. "Keep it safe, Ethan. You'll need it when the time comes." Then he looked at my father. "You've forgotten what it means to earn something. Maybe he'll remind you." Richard didn't say a word. He just stared at the envelope like it might burn him. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen. The moonlight spilled across the table. Catching the edge of the wax seal, I ran my thumb over it, tracing the initials. C.M. For the first time, I felt the weight of it. This wasn't just a letter. It was proof of something my father had spent his life denying. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Grandpa's door closed softly. I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. But for the first time since coming home, I knew exactly what side I was on. The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. Snowlight filled the kitchen. That kind of pale, silvery glow that makes everything feel colder than it already is. My father was gone before sunrise, his truck tracks still fresh in the driveway. My mother sat at the table, a mug of untouched coffee in her hands. She didn't look up when I walked in. "He said you'd cause trouble," she murmured. I poured myself a cup, ignoring the sting in her voice. "Trouble's already here," she exhaled, long and tired. "Ethan, you don't understand the pressure your father's under. The company's barely standing, the bank's breathing down his neck, and his solution is to sell the only thing Grandpa has left." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, like she was afraid he might still be listening. "You think I like it? This isn't easy for any of us." I wanted to believe that, but her tone was flat. She'd made her peace with it already. Grandpa's cane clicked against the floor as he entered. He looked more awake than either of us. "You two talking about me again?" My mother straightened. "Of course not, Dad. We were just—" He cut her off. "Save it. I've heard enough polite lies in this house to last 2 lifetimes." She flinched but said nothing. He turned to me. "Come on, Ethan. Let's take a walk before the snow melts." We went outside. The cold biting our faces. The air was sharp, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe too fast. He walked slow, his boots crunching in rhythm with his cane. We made it to the old fence line that marked the edge of the property. Beyond it stretched the meadow where I used to build forts with Ben. He stopped and looked toward the mountains. "You know what your grandmother loved about this place?" I shook my head. "It changes, but it stays. Seasons roll through. People come and go, but the mountain doesn't flinch." She used to say that was how families were supposed to be. Unshakable. Even when they fought. I kicked at the snow, watching it scatter. "Feels like ours forgot that part." He chuckled softly. "Yeah. Richard's chasing ghosts. He wants to prove he can build what's already built. What happens if he goes through with the sale?" Grandpa's eyes narrowed. "Then we remind him what this house stands for." I studied him, wondering if he already had a plan. That afternoon, the lawyer called. His name was Stephen Keller, the same man I'd heard Dad mention. My mother answered on speaker. "Mr. Miller, this is just a courtesy reminder about tomorrow's meeting." Keller said, "We'll need your father's signature to finalize the transfer." My mother's voice wavered. "Of course," she said. "We'll be there." Grandpa's eyes met mine across the room. He didn't say a word, but I knew exactly what he was thinking. After the call ended, I followed him to the study. He closed the door behind us and leaned on his cane. "He's been planning this for months," I said. "Longer," Grandpa replied. "Keller's been circling this property for years. Your father just gave him an opening. There's got to be a way to stop it." He smiled faintly. "There is. That's what the letter's for." My pulse quickened. "What's in it?" You'll find out soon enough. But you need to be there tomorrow. At the signing. At the reckoning. That night. The storm came back. I lay awake listening to the wind beat against the windows. The house groaning with every gust. Somewhere down the hall. A door slammed. Footsteps followed. I opened my door to see Ben standing there. Pale. Tense. We need to talk, he said. I followed him downstairs. He paced the living room, rubbing his hands together. Look. I didn't know it would go this far. Keller said it was just paperwork. I thought Dad was refinancing, not selling the place. You believed that. He stopped pacing. I wanted to. So what changed? He hesitated, then pulled a folder from his coat. Found this in Dad's briefcase. Thought you should see it. Inside was a copy of the sale agreement. My father's signature was already on it. So was Lydia's. I felt my stomach drop. She's part of this too. Ben nodded. Keller promised her a position on the project's community board. She thinks she's helping. Helping herself. You mean? He didn't argue. I could see the shame written all over his face. We can't let this happen, I said. He looked at me helplessly. You think I can stop him? He still sees me as the golden son who never says no. Then maybe it's time you did. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped when we heard a sound upstairs. Grandpa's door again? This time the footsteps were slower. He appeared at the top of the stairs, holding something in his hand. The envelope. It's time, he said. We gathered around the dining table. The air was thick with tension. Grandpa sat down, motioning for us to do the same. Your grandmother wrote this after she got sick, he said. She didn't want to trust lawyers or banks. She trusted us. Or at least, she hoped she could. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His voice trembled, but his words were steady. This house, and all its land, shall remain in the name of the Miller Family Trust. The beneficiary is to be Ethan Miller, with guardianship rights extending to Arthur Miller until his passing. The words hit me like a thunderclap. I looked at him, speechless. She left it to you, Grandpa said quietly. She knew you'd protect it. Ben sat back, stunned. Dad's going to lose it. Let him. Grandpa said. Some lessons come late. My heart pounded. I didn't know what to feel. Gratitude. Fear. Disbelief. What do we do now? I asked. We wait until morning, Grandpa said. Then we let the truth speak for itself. None of us slept that night. I could hear Ben moving around in the next room, the creak of the floorboards marking his guilt. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the years I spent running from this family, from this house, from the weight of being the one who cared too much. Now the house was mine, and it didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, sharp blue. Grandpa was already dressed when I came downstairs, his coat on, the letter folded neatly in his pocket. He looked at me with a quiet resolve that made my throat tighten. Ready? He asked. I nodded. Even though I wasn't. The drive to Keller's office was silent. Ben sat in the back seat, staring out the window. When we arrived, my father's truck was already there. Lydia was beside him, perfect as ever. Inside, Keller greeted us with a politician's smile. Mr. Miller. Mrs. Miller. Glad you could make it. And you must be Ethan. I didn't shake his hand. My father stood near the conference table, papers laid out in front of him. He didn't look surprised to see us. Dad. Grandpa said, You're not signing anything today. Richard sighed. Dad. Not now. Grandpa reached into his coat, pulled out the letter, and set it on the table. Now. Keller frowned. What's this? The will of Charlotte Miller. Grandpa said. Read it. Keller adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. His expression shifted. Sir, this changes things. My father snatched the paper. What the hell is this supposed to be? The truth, I said. He turned to me, anger flashing in his eyes. You think a piece of paper fixes everything? It's not supposed to fix anything, I said. It's supposed to stop you. He started to speak, but Keller interrupted. Legally, this document supersedes your agreement. The property belongs to Ethan Miller. Silence filled the room. My father's face went red. His jaw clenched so tight it trembled. Lydia looked away. Grandpa leaned back. Satisfied. Charlotte always knew you'd try to sell what you didn't build. My father didn't respond. He just stared at the letter, his empire crumbling in his hands. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the start. When we left Keller's office, the wind outside cut sharper than before. My father walked ahead, shoulders tight, face unreadably. Lydia trailed behind him, her heels slipping on the ice. Ben and I followed in silence until we reached the parking lot. He stopped beside his truck, turned, and pointed at me. You think this is over? That letter doesn't change what this family needs. It changes everything. I said, the house isn't yours to sell. He stepped closer, his breath clouding the air between us. You always had a talent for ruining things you don't understand. I met his stare, the years of silence between us cracking open. Maybe I finally understand too much. He scoffed, got into his truck, and slammed the door. Lydia hesitated, her expression caught between pity and calculation. Then she followed him without another word. Ben exhaled, rubbing his face. Well, that went about as bad as expected. No, I said. That went exactly right. We drove back to the house with Grandpa in the back seat. He was quiet the whole ride, his eyes closed like he was conserving energy for whatever came next. When we pulled into the driveway, he opened his eyes and said softly, "It's not done yet." Inside, the house felt colder than usual. My mother was in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. She froze when she saw us. What happened? Grandpa answered before I could. The truth happened. Her hand trembled slightly as she hung up. Your father's furious, she said. He's on his way home. Let him come. Grandpa replied. Ben leaned against the counter. You sure about this? Grandpa, you just lit a fuse. He gave a faint smile. Sometimes fire is the only thing that clears the fog. We didn't have to wait long. The front door slammed open 20 minutes later. My father stormed in, eyes wild, face red. You had no right, he shouted. That letter was private family business. It's the only kind that matters. Grandpa said, the kind that tells the truth. Dad slammed his hand on the table. That woman's been dead 15 years. And you're still letting her run this family. Grandpa's voice stayed calm. Maybe if you'd listened to her when she was alive, you wouldn't be standing here now. The silence that followed was thick. My mother tried to step between them, her voice trembling. Please, stop this. My father turned on her. You knew about it, didn't you? She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I swear I didn't. He looked back at me. You think you've won something, don't you? You have no idea what you're holding. That house isn't a gift. It's a burden. Maybe, I said. But at least it's mine to carry. He stared at me for a long time, his chest heaving, then grabbed his coat and walked out. The door slammed so hard the frame shook. After that, the house went quiet. My mother sat down, her face pale. Ben poured her a glass of water, his hands unsteady. Grandpa looked at me and said, he'll try again. People like your father always do. I knew he was right. The next few days were uneasy. Dad stopped coming home. And when he did, he barely spoke. Lydia kept calling Ben, trying to calm things down. But every conversation ended the same way, her asking him to see reason, him hanging up. I spent most of my time fixing what I could around the house. Broken shingles, creaking steps, the little things that made it feel alive again. One evening, I was replacing a board on the porch when Ben came outside holding his phone. You need to see this, he said. He showed me a news article from the Denver Post. It was about the renewal project, with a photo of Keller shaking hands with the mayor. In the background stood Lydia, smiling for the camera. The caption read, Local partners finalize plans for historic redevelopment. My stomach dropped. She's still going through with it. Ben nodded. And Keller's saying publicly that the property transfer's already underway. That's not possible. The will. He shrugged helplessly. He's betting you'll back down before it goes to court. I looked out across the yard. the last of the snow melting into slush. The same land they were trying to erase. I could almost hear Grandma's voice. That calm strength in every word she'd ever spoken through Grandpa. "We fight with truth," she'd said once. Not with noise. But I was starting to think maybe the truth wasn't enough. The next morning, I went through Grandpa's old desk. The drawers were filled with yellowed papers. Photos. Ledgers from the construction days. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a box of screws, I found a small metal key tied with a faded ribbon. The initials C. M. were carved into it. My chest tightened. Grandpa was in his chair by the window when I brought it to him. He smiled when he saw it. "You found it. What is it?" "The key to everything." I turned it over in my hand. "What does it open?" He nodded toward the hallway. "The attic." I climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust and old wood. In the far corner sat a chest covered in a blanket. The lock fit perfectly. Inside, I found a stack of letters, tied with the same ribbon as the key. The top letter was addressed to me. My hands shook as I unfolded it. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then the storm has come. This house carries our family's history, but also its debt. I left the truth where it could be found. Not hidden. Protected. Not for me, but for what comes next." Underneath the letter was a folder of documents stamped with city seals, deeds, trust agreements, tax forms, proof that the property wasn't just family land. It was legally protected as a heritage site. If those papers were real, Keller's project couldn't touch it without committing fraud. I ran downstairs, nearly tripping on the steps. Grandpa looked up from his chair as I held out the papers. "She protected it," I said, out of breath. "She registered it years ago. They can't sell it." He took the papers, scanning them slowly. Her handwriting was everywhere. He smiled faintly. "She always thought ahead." Ben leaned over my shoulder. "So what now?" "Now we make sure they know." That night, I drafted an email to Keller, attaching scanned copies of the documents. I sent copies to the Denver Heritage Council and the local paper. Then I sat back and waited. It didn't take long. Keller called first. His voice clipped. "You've made a mistake, Mr. Miller." "No," I said. "I just corrected one." He paused, his tone sharpening. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." I hung up. The next morning, a reporter showed up at the gate, notebook in hand. Word had already spread. By noon, the story was online. Headline: Developer faces legal challenge over historic family property. By evening, my father's truck pulled into the driveway. He didn't come inside right away. He just stood on the porch, staring at the house. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "What did you do?" I told the truth. He shook his head, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "You think you saved this place, but all you did was destroy what's left of this family." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat, because deep down, I wasn't sure he was. He walked away without another word. The porch light flickered behind him, the same light Grandma used to leave on for us when we were kids. Inside, Grandpa said quietly, "You did what had to be done." I nodded, though it didn't feel like victory. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow, covering the tracks my father left behind. The snow kept falling through the night, quiet and relentless. By morning, the driveway was covered. The world outside, wrapped in white again, like it was trying to erase everything that happened. Grandpa sat at the table, reading the paper with his glasses low on his nose. He looked calm, but his hands shook slightly when he turned the page. Ben walked in, half-dressed, his hair still wet from the shower. "You see this," he said, holding up his phone. "Keller's already putting out statements. Says we forged the documents." Grandpa lowered the paper. "Let him talk. The truth doesn't need a microphone." But Ben looked uneasy. "Dad's siding with him. He's been calling every contact he has in the city, trying to paint us as liars." I poured myself some coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "That won't matter once the council verifies the registration." Ben leaned against the counter. "You think that's going to stop him? He's not the type to lose quietly." I didn't answer. He was right. Later that afternoon, We got a letter by courier. No return address. Just our street, and a red stamp that read, Confidential. Grandpa told me to open it. Inside was a legal notice from the Denver Renewal Project, claiming the trust papers were invalid due to procedural inconsistencies. It demanded immediate turnover of the property for review. Grandpa read it, his expression hardening. This isn't law. It's intimidation. Ben Seed. He's forcing it into court. That night, I sat in my old room, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual. The storm outside grew heavier, the wind pressing against the walls like a warning. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop fighting what's already decided. It's just business. I didn't need to ask who it was. Keller. I typed back. You picked the wrong family. The next day, reporters were parked across the street. A local news van idled by the curb. I saw my father standing at the gate, talking to a man in a gray coat. Keller. Their handshake was quick, tense. Lydia hovered nearby, her face pale. I went outside, my boots sinking into the snow. My father turned when he saw me. You couldn't let it go. Could you? He said. You made it impossible to. He looked at Keller, then back at me. You're embarrassing this family in front of the whole city. No. I said. You did that the moment you sold your integrity. His voice rose. This isn't about integrity. It's about survival. Grandpa appeared on the porch behind me, his cane tapping the wooden floor. Survival without honor is just slower dying. Keller smiled politely, his breath fogging in the cold. Mr. Miller, your passion is admirable, but the law doesn't care about sentiment. I stepped closer. It cares about fraud, though, doesn't it? You used a false appraisal and an unsigned survey to push through that sale. He blinked. The first sign of surprise. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled a folded document from my jacket, found it in the county records office. You used a duplicate signature from an expired land survey. That's a felony. Ben joined us, holding his phone up. And we have your emails. Keller. The ones you sent to Dad about the adjusted numbers. My father's face went white. Keller's smirk faltered. Grandpa's voice broke the silence. I built this house with my hands. Charlotte designed it to hold our family. Not your greed. I won't watch it be turned into concrete and parking lots. Keller straightened his coat. Then I suppose we'll see what a judge thinks. He turned and walked to his car, his footsteps crunching hard in the snow. When he left, my father stared at the ground. You went too far, he said softly. No. I said. You did. He didn't answer. He just walked back toward the road, his figure shrinking in the falling snow. That evening, the house was filled with silence again. Mom barely spoke. Ben kept pacing, muttering about the court case. Grandpa sat by the fire, the glow lighting his face. I sat beside him, watching the flames shift and crackle. He said quietly, Your father wasn't always like this. He used to dream about building something real, something lasting. But dreams twist when they're fed too much fear. I wanted to believe him, but part of me wondered if some men were born broken. The next morning, we met with a lawyer downtown. Her name was Elaine Carter. Mid-40s. Sharp eyes. Firm handshake. She'd already read the documents and the letter. Her first words were clear. They have no legal standing. You're protected by the state's Historic Preservation Act. Relief hit me like a wave. But it didn't last. She looked at me seriously. That doesn't mean they won't try to drag it out. People like Keller thrive on exhaustion. Grandpa smiled faintly. Then they picked the wrong family to tire out. Elaine nodded. We'll file an injunction tomorrow morning. In the meantime, keep everything you have locked up and stay alert. When we got back home, Ben went straight to the attic to secure the papers. I went to check the locks on the doors. It was only when I reached the back porch that I saw the tire tracks. Someone had been here while we were gone. I called out for Grandpa. He came quickly, his face tightening as he saw the tracks. Inside, the study drawers were open. The envelope was gone. Ben came running down from the attic. They didn't touch anything up there, he said. Just the main floor. I sank into a chair, anger boiling under my skin. They broke in. Grandpa's expression didn't change. Then we make sure the copy speaks louder than the original. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another envelope, identical to the one stolen. "You think I keep all my cards in one hand?" I laughed, half in disbelief. "You made a copy." He smiled. "More than one." The next day, the injunction hit the city's desk. The news picked it up again. Headlines called it, "The family that stopped the bulldozers." Keller denied everything. But the leaked survey exposed his fraud. The council froze his permits pending investigation. At dinner that night, the mood was different. My mother cooked for the first time in weeks. Ben even made a toast with cheap red wine. Grandpa just sat back, watching us with tired satisfaction. I thought maybe we were finally safe. But when the phone rang near midnight, that feeling vanished. Ben answered, his face drained of color. He handed the phone to me, his voice shaking. "It's the hospital. It's Grandpa." My hand trembled as I brought the phone to my ear. The nurse's voice was calm, but her words hit like ice. "Cardiac arrest." They did everything they could. The line went quiet except for the faint hum of static. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The world outside was still buried in snow. And inside the house, it felt like the last bit of warmth had just gone out. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it should have. The roads were slick, and the snow had turned to icy slush that blurred the headlights ahead of us. No one spoke. Ben's hands were tight on the wheel, his knuckles white, and Mom stared out the window, her lips moving silently like she was praying. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. When we finally reached the ER, the fluorescent lights hit like a punch, too bright, too sterile. A nurse led us down a quiet hallway, her voice soft, practiced. "Room 214. She's sorry for our loss," before we even opened the door. Grandpa looked peaceful, like he'd just fallen asleep. His skin was pale, but his expression calm. For a moment I half expected him to open his eyes and tell me it was just another lesson, that he'd planned it all to test me. But he didn't move. Mom broke first. She collapsed against the side of the bed, sobbing into her hands. Ben stood frozen by the door, his eyes glassy. I just stared, my chest hollow. The last thing he said to me was that we were safe now. He lied. Or maybe he knew it wasn't about safety at all. The nurse came back quietly with a clipboard. "There's a personal item he wanted you to have," she said, handing me a small envelope. My name was written on it in his uneven handwriting. Outside, the morning light was breaking through the clouds, that gray winter glow that never feels like day or night. I sat in the car, staring at the envelope. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and the brass key I'd found weeks before. The note read simply, "You'll know what to do next. I trust you. Ethan." I folded it, my throat tight. Ben climbed into the driver's seat, his voice rough. "What now?" I looked at the key, then at the hospital doors. "We go home." The house felt different when we got back. Too still. Mom went straight to her room. Ben poured himself a drink and stared at the fireplace. I stood in the doorway of the study where Grandpa used to sit. The chair was empty, but his scent still lingered. Pine soap, old books, and coffee. I sat down, the envelope in my hand. The brass key glinted in the fading light. I turned it over, remembering the first time Grandpa let me hold his tool belt as a kid. He used to say every lock has a reason. I had no idea what he meant until that moment. I climbed the attic stairs again. The air was cold and still, dust swirling in the beam of my flashlight. The chest sat exactly where I left it. Inside the envelope Grandpa gave me was another folded note. The handwriting was his, though weaker than before. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't let grief make you forget your purpose. The truth isn't a weapon. It's a key. Use it wisely." Beneath the note was a smaller metal tin. I pried it open and found an old flash drive wrapped in cloth. A piece of paper was taped to it with a single line. "For the city council." My pulse quickened. I ran downstairs, plugged it into my laptop. It was full of scanned documents, letters, recordings. Grandpa had been collecting everything. Emails between Keller and city officials, signed deals, false zoning approvals. It was all there, enough to bury Keller and anyone working with him. Ben leaned over my shoulder, his voice low. "Holy hell. You could destroy them with this." "No. I said. We won't destroy them. We'll expose them. The next few days blurred together. Calls from reporters, lawyers, the city. The news of Grandpa's death spread fast. And so did the story about the corruption behind the Denver Renewal Project. Keller went on record denying everything. But the files told a different story. By the end of the week, his face was on every local broadcast. Investigations had begun. Mom barely left her room. When she did, she looked smaller somehow, like the fight had drained out of her. I tried to talk to her, but every conversation ended in silence. I think she was grieving more than Grandpa. She was mourning the man she married and the one he became. One night, Ben and I sat on the porch, the air cold and sharp. He took a long sip from his glass and said quietly, "I think Dad's gone for good." I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know if that was a loss or a relief. A week after the funeral, a letter arrived from Keller's law firm, a formal notice of withdrawal. He'd resigned from the project, citing unforeseen complications. My father's signature was on a separate sheet, voiding the sale agreement. No apology, no explanation, just legal cleanup. Ben handed it to me, shaking his head. Guess that's his version of sorry. I placed the papers on the table. Maybe that's all we'll get. Later that night, I went out to the backyard. The snow had melted, revealing patches of brown grass and the faint outline of the path Grandpa and I used to shovel together. I could almost hear his voice beside me, calm and steady. Keep the fire burning. Ethan, don't let the wind win. Inside, the fireplace was still going. Ben had fallen asleep on the couch, and Mom sat quietly in Grandpa's chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as I came in. "He was proud of you," she said softly. "You know that, right?" I nodded. But the words hit harder than I expected. She smiled faintly. "He told me once that you had his stubbornness. I used to think it would drive you away. Now I see it's what kept you here." We sat there for a while, watching the fire fade to embers. The next morning, I met with Elaine, our lawyer. She smiled when she saw me. "The city's closing the investigation. Keller's facing charges. And the heritage status is now permanent. The property can't be sold or altered without your consent." I exhaled slowly, the weight I'd carried for months finally lifting. "So it's done." "It's done," she said. But she paused before leaving. "Not everyone gets to win a fight like this. Ethan, make it count." When I drove home, the sun was setting behind the mountains. The house glowed in the fading light, on the same warm color it had when I was a kid coming home from school. I parked by the porch, sat for a moment, and watched as the wind moved through the trees. Inside, I placed the brass key on the mantel beside Grandpa's photo. His eyes, caught mid-laugh in that old black and white picture, seemed to look right at me. I said quietly. I kept it safe. Outside, the snow started again, light and soft, just enough to dust the ground. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a burden. It felt alive again. And as I stood there in the quiet, I realized something Grandpa had been trying to teach me all along. The fight was never about ownership. It was about belonging. The house didn't need saving. We did. The spring came late that year. The last patches of snow melted slowly into the earth. And for the first time in months, the grass around the house began to show green again. The air smelled clean, like rain and pine. The Miller house stood solid against the hillside, quiet but alive, the way Grandpa would have wanted it. Mom started opening the curtains again. She filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and lemon polish, humming under her breath while she worked. Ben took over, fixing the gutters and repainting the porch railings. It was strange, seeing him there every day, covered in paint and not glued to his phone. We had both changed since the fight. Some of it was loss. Some of it was finally learning what mattered. One morning, a small white envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Keller. Inside was a single line written in pen. "You won. For now." I let out a long breath and dropped it into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened, turning to ash before it even reached the grate. Some victories don't need replies. Weeks passed. The investigation ended with Keller indicted on fraud charges, and a dozen others exposed for corruption. The mayor's office released a statement about ethics reform, and the renewal project was quietly dissolved. Reporters called, but I turned them all down. I didn't need to keep reliving it. Grandpa's lesson was already clear enough. One afternoon, Ben found an old wooden sign in the shed. The letters were faded, barely visible. It read Miller House. Etienne Jobaitsisha Joe. He handed it to me. Smiling faintly, thought maybe we could put this back up. We sanded it down, repainted the lettering, and hung it above the front door together. When we stepped back, I realized it looked exactly like it did in the old family photos. Grandpa's work. His hands had built this place board by board. And now, somehow, it felt like he was still here, watching. A few days later, Mom invited the neighbors over for dinner. Nothing fancy. Just chili, cornbread, and stories. The house was full again. Voices echoing through the halls. Kids ran up and down the stairs, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Someone started playing guitar by the fireplace. The sound was off-key but warm. I sat on the porch with Ben after everyone left. Both of us quiet for a long time. He looked at the lights glowing in the windows. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked. I thought about it. I'd built a life in Portland. My job. My friends. The sense of independence I'd fought for. But I also thought about what Grandpa wrote in his last note. The truth isn't a weapon. It's a key. I looked at Ben and said, "I think I already did enough running." He nodded slowly. Guess we both did. A week later, Mom called me into the kitchen. She was holding a box of old photographs she found in Grandpa's closet. Inside were hundreds of pictures from over the decades. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, summers on the porch. At the bottom was one photo I'd never seen before. Grandpa standing beside a woman in a white apron, his arm around her shoulders. Grandma Charlotte. Behind them, the house still half built. The frame open to the mountain air. On the back, in her handwriting, were 6 words. For whoever keeps the light on. I felt something catch in my throat. I knew then what I needed to do. By June, the house was no longer just ours. I opened it on weekends to the community as a preservation site. Kids came to learn about old architecture. Retired builders offered to help restore the barn. Mom started a garden with the local school. And Ben handled repairs. The Miller House wasn't a relic anymore. It was a living thing, breathing again with every new set of footsteps that walked through its doors. Sometimes, when the evenings got quiet, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun dip behind the Rockies. The sky would turn that deep orange Grandma used to love, and the shadows would stretch long across the yard. I'd hear the faint creak of the porch boards and almost expect to see Grandpa sitting beside me. Hat tilted. That knowing half-smile on his face. "You did good, kid," he'd probably say. Maybe I was finally starting to believe it. One evening, after a long day of work, Ben joined me with 2 beers. He handed me one and said, "You know, I used to think you were the lucky one. Got out. Made your own life. But I think maybe luck had nothing to do with it. You just never stopped fighting." I smiled. Taking a sip. Someone had to. He looked toward the old oak tree near the fence, where Grandpa once tied a rope swing for us when we were kids. The rope was gone now, but the branch still hung strong. Ben said quietly, "Maybe we should put it back up." I nodded. Maybe we should. A few days later, we did. The swing creaked under its new weight, but it held firm. That evening, as the wind moved through the pines and the porch lights flickered on, I realized the house didn't just belong to the past anymore. It was finally ready for the future. As the stars came out, I walked inside. The old floors warm under my feet. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting a soft glow across Grandpa's photo. I picked up the brass key from the mantel and turned it in my hand one last time before setting it beside the frame. Some doors, I thought, don't need to be locked anymore. And for the first time since I was a boy, I felt completely at peace. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Maybe you've had your own battles, your own house to protect, your own ghosts to face. If you have, I get it. Sometimes we don't fight to win. We fight to keep something worth remembering alive. So if this story found you tonight, I hope it reminded you that belonging isn't given. It's built. One hard choice at a time. Stick around. There are more stories like this. And maybe one of them will help you find the key you've been holding all along.